In the late afternoon on a quiet stretch of California highway, legendary actor and director Clint Eastwood drove his modest pickup truck toward his Carmel property. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees lining the road as he tapped, his fingers on the steering wheel, keeping time with the jazz playing softly on the radio. At 72, the Hollywood icon preferred solitude and the simple pleasures of small-town life, away from the chaos of Los Angeles and the constant attention that came with being one of America's most recognizable faces. His weathered hands gripped the wheel as his thoughts drifted to the film he was directing. He mentally reviewed the day's shooting schedule for tomorrow, making notes to himself about a particular scene that wasn't quite working. The protagonist's motivation didn't feel authentic enough. Perhaps he needed to have a heart-to-heart with his lead actor. These quiet drives often gave him the mental space to solve creative problems that seemed insurmountable in the noise of a bustling film set. The peaceful moment was shattered by the distinctive rumble of motorcycles. Eastwood's blue eyes flicked to his rearview mirror, narrowing slightly as he spotted 3 bikers gaining on him rapidly. Their machines were custom choppers, chrome gleaming in the late afternoon sun, the riders wearing patched leather jackets that identified them as members of a local group that occasionally caused trouble in neighboring towns. Eastwood didn't think much of it at first. The roads around Carmel were popular with motorcycle enthusiasts, and he'd seen plenty during his years living in the area. But something about their formation and speed raised the hairs on the back of his neck, an instinct he'd learned to trust both on and off camera. The bikers spread out, one pulling alongside his driver's side window, another to his right, while the third stayed close behind. The lead rider, a hulking figure with a thick beard and sunglasses, made a gesture for Eastwood to pull over at an upcoming rest area. The director noticed the man's hands were adorned with crude tattoos that spread up his arms and disappeared under his leather vest. Eastwood considered his options. At his age, he wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't one to be intimidated either. The rest area was just ahead, a small turnout with a couple of picnic tables and a trash can, currently empty of other vehicles. After a moment's consideration, he signaled and pulled in, the truck's tires crunching on the gravel as he came to a stop. The bikers circled once before parking their motorcycles in a way that partially blocked his exit. The message was clear. They weren't planning on a friendly chat about the weather or asking for directions. Eastwood shut off his engine and sat for a moment, taking a deep breath. Throughout his life, he'd faced all manner of men, some on movie sets playing tough guys, others who actually were. He'd grown up during the Depression, served in the Army, worked blue-collar jobs before becoming an actor. The lines between his on-screen personas and his real character sometimes blurred in the public imagination. But one thing remained consistent. Clint Eastwood didn't look for fights, but he didn't run from them either. He stepped out of his truck, with the unhurried movements of a man who had nothing to prove. His boots hit the gravel with a soft crunch as he stood to his full height, still impressive despite his age. He wore a simple outfit, jeans, a plain button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a light jacket that did little to hide his still-fit frame. The 3 bikers approached, spreading out in front of him. The leader, the bearded man who'd signaled him to pull over, stepped forward. Up close, Eastwood could see the man was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, with a face that had seen its share of fights and hard living. "Nice truck, old-timer," the leader said, his voice carrying a note of mockery. "Bit isolated. Out here, isn't it?" Eastwood said nothing, just regarded the man with the same steely gaze that had become his trademark in dozens of films. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable for everyone except Eastwood himself, who had mastered the art of quiet intimidation through decades of playing men of few words. The second biker, shorter but with the coiled energy of a street fighter, moved closer. "My friend asked you a question. Seems rude not to answer." He had a distinctive scar running through his right eyebrow, his face flushed with either alcohol or adrenaline, possibly both. The third hung back slightly, constantly scanning the empty road. He was younger than the others with nervous eyes. That suggested he might be new to this kind of intimidation game. His hand kept straying to his pocket, though whether reaching for a weapon or just a nervous habit, Eastwood couldn't be sure. "Wallet and keys," the leader finally said, dropping all pretense. "Hand 'em over and we'll be on our way." Eastwood's expression didn't change. "I don't think so," he replied, his voice that familiar gravelly rumble that had delivered so many memorable lines. The leader's eyes narrowed, still not recognizing who he was dealing with. The lighting was dim under the trees, and perhaps the man wasn't much of a moviegoer. Or maybe the idea that Clint Eastwood would be driving alone on this stretch of road was too improbable to consider. "Listen, Grandpa," the leader said, taking another step forward. "I'm not asking. There's 3 of us and 1 of you. I don't care how tough you think you are." A ghost of a smile touched Eastwood's lips, not reaching his eyes. "True enough," he said, his tone conversational. "But that might not be the advantage you think it is." The leader's patience wore thin. He reached out to grab Eastwood's jacket, a move the actor had anticipated from the moment the man's weight shifted slightly forward. What happened next would have seemed like something from one of Eastwood's action movies if anyone had been around to witness it. Before the biker's hand could make contact, Eastwood sidestepped with surprising agility for a man his age. His own hand shot up, gripping the biker's outstretched wrist and using the man's momentum to pull him off balance. The move was smooth, efficient, the product of years of practice rather than movie choreography. The biker stumbled forward, surprise written across his face as he tried to process how the older man had so easily disrupted his attack. His companions stood frozen for a moment, equally shocked by the unexpected display of skill. The leader recovered quickly, anger replacing surprise as he whirled around to face Eastwood again. But now there was uncertainty in his eyes, the first flicker of doubt that maybe they had chosen the wrong target for their roadside intimidation. "What the hell?" he growled, rubbing his wrist where Eastwood's grip had been surprisingly strong. The sun broke through the trees just then, illuminating Eastwood's face more clearly, and a flash of recognition finally dawned in the biker's eyes. "Wait a minute." The second biker saw it too. "Holy shit," he muttered, taking a half step back. "That's Clint fucking Eastwood." The third biker, the nervous one, let out a low whistle. "Dirty Harry? Are you kidding me?" Eastwood didn't acknowledge the recognition, maintaining his ready stance. His eyes remained fixed on the leader, who now faced a choice: back down and lose face in front of his crew, or escalate against a man who, even at his age, had just demonstrated he was more than capable of handling himself, not to mention a Hollywood legend whose very name carried weight. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, the only sounds the distant call of birds and the cooling tick of motorcycle engines. The moment stretched, a standoff worthy of one of Eastwood's Western films, though this was no movie set, and there were no cameras rolling to capture what would happen next. The tension in the air seemed to stretch like a rubber band pulled to its limit. The leader of the bikers stood with his feet planted wide, his earlier confidence now mixed with visible uncertainty. His eyes darted between his 2 companions, perhaps looking for some sign of what to do next. The revelation that they were facing Clint Eastwood had clearly thrown them off balance, but pride can be a powerful force, especially with an audience watching. "I don't care if you're the president," the leader finally said, his voice not quite carrying the same conviction as before. "This doesn't change anything." Eastwood remained silent, his breathing steady. There was no fear in his stance, no panic in his eyes, just the calm readiness of someone who had prepared for moments like this long before he ever stepped in front of a camera. The sun had lowered in the sky, casting long shadows across the rest area, giving the whole scene an almost cinematic quality. The second biker, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Come on, man," he muttered to the leader. "This isn't worth it." The leader shot him a look that could have melted steel. "Shut up," he hissed. Then turning back to Eastwood, "Your movies don't scare me, old man." Eastwood finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Not trying to scare you, just giving you a chance to walk away." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty perhaps, seemed to how the leader's anger rather than diffuse it. With a growl of frustration, he lunged forward, aiming a wild punch at Eastwood's face. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion to the watching bikers. Eastwood moved with the fluid grace, of someone who had spent decades training his body. He sidestepped the punch easily, his own hands coming up in a defensive position that looked nothing like the exaggerated stances of movie kung fu, but rather the practical, efficient movements of real martial arts. The leader's momentum carried him forward as Eastwood pivoted, using the man's own weight against him. With a quick sweep of his leg and a subtle shift of his hands, Eastwood sent the larger man tumbling to the ground. The biker landed hard on his back, the air rushing from his lungs with an audible "oof." Before the other two could react, Eastwood had already reset his stance, ready for them. His expression hadn't changed. No triumphant smile, no taunting words, just the focused attention of someone completely present in the moment. The scarred biker hesitated, clearly reassessing the situation. The younger one took a half-step back, his hand still hovering near his pocket. "Don't," Eastwood said to him, his eyes flicking briefly to the nervous gesture. "Whatever you're thinking about pulling out of that pocket, don't." On the ground, the leader struggled to regain his breath, rolling onto his side with a groan. The fall had been more humiliating than harmful, but it had made a powerful point. Eastwood hadn't struck him, hadn't thrown a punch. He'd simply used the biker's own aggression against him. "He doesn't have anything," the scarred biker said quickly, raising his hands slightly. "We weren't looking for real trouble." Eastwood kept his position, unconvinced. "Could have fooled me." The fallen leader pushed himself to his knees, his face flushed with a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and lingering anger. "How the hell did you do that?" he demanded, sounding more bewildered than threatening now. Eastwood allowed himself a small, tight smile. "Been studying karate longer than you've been alive, probably." The bikers exchanged looks of disbelief. This wasn't part of the Eastwood legend they knew from movies, the gunslinger, the cop with the massive revolver. This was something else, entirely. "Since the 50s, Eastwood continued, relaxing his stance slightly but remaining alert. "Started while filming Rawhide. Found it helped with balance, focus. Got more serious over the years." The scarred biker let out a low whistle. "Black belt?" Eastwood gave a slight nod but didn't elaborate. His eyes remained watchful as the leader got to his feet, dusting himself off with as much dignity as he could. "Huster." "Look," the leader said, his tone markedly different now. "We made a mistake. Didn't know who you were." "Wouldn't have made a difference," Eastwood replied. "Don't much care for bullies, famous or not." The three men stood in awkward silence for a moment. The situation had evolved into something none of them had anticipated. For the bikers, what should have been a simple intimidation had become a humbling encounter, with both a Hollywood legend and, apparently, a skilled martial artist. For Eastwood, it was an unwelcome interruption to his peaceful drive, but perhaps not an entirely surprising one. The young biker suddenly spoke up. "My grandfather's not going to believe this," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed, as if he'd accidentally revealed too much about himself. Eastwood studied him for a moment. "Your grandfather a fan?" The young man nodded. "Has every one of your movies made me watch them growing up. Doesn't seem like the lessons stuck," Eastwood observed dryly. The young biker had the decency to look ashamed, dropping his gaze to the gravel beneath his boots. The leader, having regained some composure, cleared his throat. "We'll be going now," he said, trying to salvage some authority in his voice. Eastwood nodded but added, "Might want to find a different hobby. This one's not working out so well for you." The scarred biker actually chuckled at that, earning a glare from his leader. The tension in the air had shifted, becoming something less dangerous but still charged with the strange energy of the encounter. As the bikers began backing toward their motorcycles, the leader paused. "No hard feelings?" he asked. A question that seemed absurd given the circumstances, but was perhaps the only way he could think to end the confrontation, with some shred of dignity and tact. Eastwood considered him for a moment. "Depends on what you do next," he finally replied. The bikers mounted their machines, the engines roaring to life in the quiet afternoon. Before pulling away, the leader gave Eastwood a nod that might have contained a hint of reluctant respect. The three of them pulled out onto the highway and accelerated away, their noise gradually fading into the distance. Eastwood watched until they were out of sight before allowing his shoulders to relax. He rolled his neck slowly, feeling the tension begin to leave his body. At his age, even a brief physical confrontation like this would leave him feeling it tomorrow, martial arts training or not. He walked back to his truck, climbed in, and sat, for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The encounter had lasted only minutes but felt much longer. He was glad it hadn't escalated further, not for his sake, but for theirs. He had no desire to hurt anyone, regardless of how the encounter had begun. Starting the engine, he pulled back onto the highway, resuming his journey home. The jazz CD had ended during the confrontation, and now only the sound of the tires on pavement filled the cab. Eastwood found himself thinking about the young biker, the one whose grandfather was a fan. There had been something in his eyes, a reluctance perhaps that suggested he might not be fully committed to the path he was on. Eastwood had seen that look before, both in real life and in characters he'd played or directed, people at a crossroads, capable of change if given the right push. He wondered if today might have been such a moment for that young man. Sometimes life's lessons came from unexpected places. As the road wound through the California landscape, Eastwood's thoughts returned to his film. Somehow the confrontation had helped clarify the character motivation he'd been struggling with earlier. There was something about facing real tension that crystallized the artificial kind he created on screen. He'd use that tomorrow channel it into direction that would bring authenticity to the scene. That was the thing about life. Even its challenges could become material, grist for the creative mill. Eastwood had always known this, had drawn on his experiences to inform his art for decades. Today was just one more example, one more small moment that might find its way, transformed, into someone, what the bikers couldn't have known as they rode. Away from their humbling encounter was just how deeply martial arts had shaped Clint Eastwood's life beyond the cameras. The sun was beginning to set as Eastwood continued his drive home, the golden light painting the coastal landscape in warm hues. His thoughts drifted back to those early days on the Rawhide set, when a stunt coordinator had first introduced him to karate. It had been 1959, and Eastwood was still finding his footing as an actor. The physical demands of playing Cowboy Rowdy Yates were considerable, and Eastwood had been looking for ways to stay fit that wouldn't leave him too sore for filming. The stunt coordinator, an old Hollywood veteran who had spent time in Japan after the war, suggested martial arts might help with balance and flexibility. Eastwood remembered his first lesson clearly, the awkwardness of the stances, the frustrated attempts to coordinate movements that seemed so foreign to his Western upbringing. He'd almost quit after that first day, his muscles protesting in ways they never had before. But something about the discipline called to him resonated with his own internal sense of order. "You're not fighting against someone else," his first instructor had told him. "You're fighting against yourself, your own limitations, your own mind." That philosophy had stuck with Eastwood through the decades. As his truck rounded a curve in the coastal highway, he flexed his hands on the steering wheel, feeling the slight stiffness in the knuckles, not just from age but from thousands of hours of training. His black belt had come after nearly 15 years of dedicated practice, earned without fanfare or public acknowledgement. He'd kept that part of his life private, separate from his Hollywood persona. Only a handful of people knew about his dedication to martial arts. He preferred it that way. Let the public see the characters he played, the tough guys with guns and one-liners, the real discipline, the daily practice and meditation, the philosophy that had shaped his approach to directing and life. That was personal. As he drove, Eastwood thought about how his martial arts training had influenced his filmmaking. The economy of movement, the respect for timing, the understanding that what you didn't show was often more powerful than what you did. These principles had translated directly into his directorial style. His films were often praised for their lean storytelling and unhurried pacing, qualities he'd absorbed through years of training. He pulled into the long driveway leading to his Carmel home, the familiar landscape a welcome sight after the unexpected confrontation. His house sat nestled among cypress trees, a modest structure for someone of his wealth and fame. Eastwood had never been one for ostentation. The ample Japanese-influenced garden that surrounded the property reflected his appreciation for the culture that had given him karate. Inside, he set his keys on the kitchen counter and poured himself a small glass of water, drinking it slowly as he looked out the window at the fading light. The encounter with the bikers replayed in his mind. He wasn't proud of the confrontation itself. He had always believed that avoiding a fight was preferable to winning one, but he did feel a certain satisfaction that his training had served him when needed. His daily routine rarely varied. Even now in his 70s, he dedicated time each morning to his practice. He made his way to the small, sparse room at the back of his house that served as his dojo. The space contained little, just clean tatami mats, a few simple scrolls with Japanese calligraphy, and a small shrine to past teachers who had guided him through the decades. Eastwood changed into his GI, the white training uniform now soft and comfortable from years of use. The ritual of tying his black belt was one he had performed thousands of times, yet he never rushed it. Each motion was deliberate, focused. This was meditation in itself. He began with breathing exercises, feeling his heart rate slow, his mind clear. The confrontation earlier had triggered adrenaline, disrupted his inner balance. This practice would restore it. He moved through basic forms, katas he had learned as a beginner and still practiced daily. The movements came as naturally as walking now, his body remembering what his conscious mind didn't need to direct. As his practice deepened, Eastwood reflected on how differently the encounter might have played out in one of his movies. There would have been more violence, perhaps more dramatic tension. Reality was often both more mundane and more profound. He had used only what was necessary, no more, no less. That restraint was something his younger self, full of Hollywood bravado, might not have managed. After completing his practice, Eastwood sat in quiet meditation, legs folded beneath him, hands resting lightly on his thighs. In this stillness, he often found the creative solutions that eluded him in more active moments. Tonight his thoughts kept returning to the young biker, the one who had mentioned his grandfather. There had been something in the young man's eyes, a flicker of recognition that went beyond simply realizing he was confronting a famous actor. Perhaps he had seen the disconnect between the path he was on and the values his grandfather had tried to instill through those movie nights. Perhaps today's encounter would serve as a wake-up call. Eastwood wasn't naive enough to believe that one interaction could change someone's life trajectory, but he had lived long enough to know that sometimes a single moment, a brief intersection of lives, could plant a seed that might grow later, given the right conditions. His phone rang, breaking his meditation. It was his assistant, calling about tomorrow's shooting schedule. Eastwood listened, made a few decisions about scene order, and hung up. Work was never far away, even in moments of reflection. He made a simple dinner, grilled fish, rice, steamed vegetables. His diet, like much of his lifestyle, had been influenced by his study of martial arts and Eastern philosophy. He ate mindfully, another practice he had developed over the years. When he was younger, he had often eaten quickly between takes or rehearsals, barely tasting his food. Age and experience had taught him the value of presence in all aspects of life. After dinner, he reviewed the script pages for tomorrow's shoot, making small notes in the margins. The confrontation earlier had given him insight into a particular scene, a moment where his main character had to decide whether to escalate or diffuse a tense situation. He would talk to the actor about it tomorrow, share the authentic emotional experience without necessarily revealing its source. Before bed, Eastwood stood on his back porch, looking up at the night sky. Stars were beginning to appear, countless, points of light against the darkness. The ocean breeze carried the salt scent that had become so familiar during his years in Carmel. He thought about how martial arts had taught him to find balance between strength and flexibility, between action and stillness, between the public persona millions recognized and the private self few ever saw. The confrontation with the bikers would become just another experience to draw from, another memory to fold into the rich tapestry of a life lived fully. Eastwood had never been one to dwell on the past or worry excessively about the future. The present moment was where life happened, where choices were made, where art was created. As he prepared for bed, he felt a slight soreness in his shoulder, a reminder of the brief physical encounter earlier. At 72, his body didn't recover quite as quickly as it once had. But the discipline of decades helped him acknowledge the discomfort without being disturbed by it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and rewards. The film would continue. Scenes would be shot. Decisions would be made. And somewhere out on the highway, 3 bikers were perhaps reflecting on their own unexpected encounter with a man who was both exactly who they thought he was and someone entirely different. Eastwood turned out the lights and closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to the rhythm of sleep. In his last conscious thoughts, he remembered something his first karate teacher had told him. The true opponent is always oneself. Today, once again, that wisdom had proven true. Elsa's story, someday.x. The next morning dawned clear and bright, over Carmel. Eastwood woke before his alarm, a habit formed through decades of early call times and disciplined training. He lay still for a moment, taking stock of his body. The slight soreness in his shoulder from yesterday's encounter had faded to a dull reminder. Not bad for a man his age. He rose and went through his morning routine with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. A glass of water, a light breakfast of toast and fruit, and then to the small dojo for his morning practice. The routine never changed, regardless of his shooting schedule or other commitments. This consistency had been the foundation of both his martial arts training and his successful career. Today's practice felt especially meaningful after yesterday's confrontation. As he moved through his katas, Eastwood reflected on how seldom he had needed to use his training in actual self-defense. In his younger days, especially during his early fame, there had been a few bar situations, the occasional overzealous fan. But as he grew older and his public persona became more defined, people tended to give him space. The bikers had been an unusual exception. After his practice and a quick shower, Eastwood dressed and headed to the film set. He drove the same truck from yesterday, showing no inclination to switch to something less recognizable after the highway incident. The morning traffic was light, and he used the drive time to mentally prepare for the day's shooting. The set was already buzzing with activity when he arrived. Crew members nodded respectfully as he walked toward his director's chair. Eastwood had earned a reputation for running efficient, quiet sets. No shouting, no drama, just focused work. This approach, too, had its roots in his martial arts training. Minimum effort for maximum effect. "Morning," he said to his assistant director, a talented young filmmaker who had worked with him on several projects. "Any issues I should know about?" "Nothing major," the AD replied. "The lighting rig for the interrogation scene needed some adjustments, but they're almost done. We should be ready to shoot in 20. Eastwood nodded, then asked, "Is Tom here yet?" Tom was his lead actor, the one he needed to talk to about the character motivation he'd been pondering during yesterday's drive. "In makeup." "Want me to get him?" "No rush, I'll catch him before we set up." Eastwood found a quiet corner and reviewed the day's scenes again. The schedule called for filming an intense confrontation between the protagonist and a group of antagonists, a scene that now felt different to Eastwood after his real-life experience yesterday. When Tom emerged from the makeup trailer, Eastwood motioned him over. The younger actor approached eagerly. Despite his own growing fame, he still viewed working with Eastwood as a master class in acting and filmmaking. "Got a minute?" Eastwood asked. "Of course." Tom sat in the empty chair beside. The director. Eastwood rarely gave lengthy direction. His style was more about asking questions, guiding actors to discover their own interpretation, rather than imposing his vision. But today, he had something specific to share. "Been thinking about the confrontation scene," he began. "About your character's reaction when he's surrounded?" Tom nodded. They had discussed this scene before, but both had felt something was missing in the approach. "You know, sometimes real courage isn't about throwing the first punch," Eastwood continued. "It's about keeping your center when everything around you is chaos. Like in the script where I have to face down those three guys? Exactly. Eastwood paused, considering how much of yesterday's incident to share. Had an interesting experience driving home yesterday. Got me thinking about this scene differently. He gave Tom a brief, simplified version of the encounter with the bikers, leaving out certain details but conveying the essential emotional truth of the moment. The key wasn't showing them I was stronger, he explained. It was showing them I wasn't afraid. Fear is what bullies feed on. Take that away, and they don't know what to do. Tom listened intently, clearly trying to absorb not just the words, but the underlying philosophy. So for the scene, you're saying my character should be calmer? Less reactive? Try it. See how it feels. Instead of tensing up when they surround you, try relaxing. Make your voice quieter instead of louder. Watch what that does to the energy of the scene. The younger actor nodded thoughtfully. I'll give it a shot. As they prepared to film, Eastwood noticed a different quality in Tom's preparation. He was centering himself, focusing inward rather than pumping himself up as he had in previous takes of similar scenes. Good. He was understanding. The Us scene called for Tom's character to be confronted by three men in an empty warehouse. As filming began, Eastwood watched carefully from behind the monitor. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Where before Tom had portrayed nervous energy and defensive posturing, now he embodied calm readiness. His voice, when he delivered his lines, was steady and controlled. Cut, Eastwood called after the first take. The set fell silent, waiting for his assessment. That's it. That's exactly what we need. The actors looked pleased but slightly surprised at getting it in one take. Eastwood wasn't known for excessive praise. Let's do one more for safety, then move on, he added. As the crew reset for another take, Eastwood's phone buzzed in his pocket. He rarely kept it on during shooting, but today he was waiting for a call from his daughter. He glanced at the screen and was surprised to see a local number he didn't recognize. Curious, he stepped away from the set to answer. Eastwood, he said simply. Mr. Eastwood? The voice was young, uncertain. You probably don't remember me, but we, met yesterday? On the highway? Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly. It was the young biker, the one who had mentioned his grandfather being a fan. I remember, he replied neutrally. I wanted to apologize, the young man said, his words coming faster now. What we did wasn't right. I've been thinking about it all night, and I just felt like I needed to call and tell you that. Eastwood was silent for a moment, surprised by the call. How'd you get this number? He finally asked, not unkindly. The young man hesitated. My grandfather knows someone who works at your production company. I sort of begged him to get me a way to contact you. I promise I won't share it or anything. Despite himself, Eastwood felt impressed by the initiative this took. Apology accepted, he said. Not many people would make that call. I've been heading down a bad road, the young man continued, sounding relieved. Hanging with the wrong crowd yesterday was kind of a wake-up call, you know. Sometimes that's how it happens, Eastwood replied. One moment that makes you see things differently. There was a pause on the line. Can I ask you something, Mr. Eastwood? Go ahead. How did you learn to stay so calm? Even when we were trying to scare you, you never seemed afraid. Eastwood considered the question seriously. Fear's always there, he said. But you don't have to let it control you. That takes practice. Daily practice. Like your martial arts training? That's part of it. But it's more about how you approach life, staying present, not getting caught up in what might happen. From the corner of his eye, Eastwood could see his AD signaling that they were ready for the next take. Listen, Eastwood said, I've got to get back to work. But remember what I said yesterday about finding a different hobby? Maybe look into martial arts. Might give you some of that discipline you're looking for. I will, the young man said, his voice firmer now. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, for everything. Eastwood ended the call and rejoined the crew, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with the film they were making. That young man might actually change course, might find a better path. You never knew what impact a brief encounter might have. "Ready when you are, Mr. Eastwood," his AD said. "Let's go," Eastwood replied, refocusing on the scene before them. The rest of the day's shooting went smoothly. Tom's performance in the confrontation scene had a quality that excited everyone on set, an authenticity that couldn't be faked. Sometimes the best direction came from real life, from genuine experience rather than intellectual understanding. They reviewed the footage at the end of the day. Eastwood felt certain they had captured something special. Not just a good scene for the film, but a moment of truth about human nature, about courage and fear, about standing your ground without escalating violence. These were themes he had explored throughout his career, both as an actor and director. But today, informed by yesterday's highway encounter and its unexpected aftermath, the exploration felt especially meaningful. Driving home that evening, Eastwood found himself watching his rearview mirror with a slight smile. No bikers today, just the open road and the setting sun. Life had a way of providing exactly the experiences you needed, precisely when you needed them, if you were paying attention. A week passed since the encounter on the highway and the unexpected phone call that followed. Eastwood had wrapped the pivotal confrontation scene in his film, with both cast and crew agreeing it was among the strongest sequences they'd shot. The movie was nearing completion, just a few more days of filming before post-production would begin. On this particular morning, Eastwood arrived at his production office earlier than usual. He had paperwork to review, budget approvals, marketing plans, the mundane business side of filmmaking that he handled with the same focused attention he gave to his creative work. A cardboard box sat on his assistant's desk with his name scribbled on it in black marker. No return address, just "for Clint Eastwood" written in an unsteady hand. "This came for you yesterday afternoon," his assistant explained as she handed him his usual black coffee. "Security checked it. Just looks like books. Inside." Eastwood nodded his thanks and carried the mysterious package into his office. Unexpected fan mail wasn't uncommon, though most went to the studio rather than directly to his production company. He set his coffee down and opened the box carefully. Inside, he found 3 items wrapped in plain brown paper. The first was a book, "The Way of Karate Beyond Technique," by the renowned Japanese master Shigeru Igami. It was an older edition, clearly well-read judging by the worn spine and dog-eared pages. The second package contained a vintage poster from The Outlaw Josie Wales, one of Eastwood's classic westerns, rolled carefully and protected by a cardboard tube. The third item was smaller, heavier than it looked. Eastwood unwrapped it to find a simple wooden box with Japanese characters burned into the lid. Inside, nestled in red fabric, was an old karate medal, tarnished with age but still bearing the engraved date of a 1967 tournament. A folded note lay at the bottom of the cardboard shipping box. Eastwood opened it, immediately recognizing the same handwriting that had addressed the package. "Mr. Eastwood," it began. "This belonged to my grandfather. He won it the year before he left Japan to come to America. He taught karate in San Francisco for 40 years before arthritis took away his ability to practice. When I was a kid, he used to make me watch your movies, saying you understood something that most Americans didn't about discipline and respect. I never really got it until now. I've started training at his old dojo. It's harder than I thought it would be, but I'm sticking with it. My grandfather cried when I told him. Said it wasn't too late to find a better path. The book is from his collection. He thought you might appreciate it, though he figures you've probably read it. The poster is from me. Found it at an old record store. Thought it might bring back some good memories. I won't bother you again. Just wanted to say thank you for that moment of clarity on the highway. Some lessons you have to learn the hard way, I guess. P.S. The other 2 guys send their apologies, too. Turns out they're also not as tough as they thought." The note was unsigned, but Eastwood knew exactly who had sent it. He set it down and picked up the medal again, feeling its weight in his palm. The gesture was unexpected and oddly touching. A small connection across generations, linked by an art form that had shaped them in different ways. Eastwood placed the medal back in its wooden box and set it on his desk beside a small bonsai tree, a gift from a Japanese director he'd worked with years ago. The tree required daily attention, careful pruning, constant awareness, much like martial arts practice. He'd kept it alive for nearly a decade now, its gnarled trunk and delicate branches a reminder of the beauty that comes from patient discipline. His phone rang, the production designer calling about the final scene they were shooting tomorrow. Eastwood answered and dove back into the work of filmmaking, the package temporarily forgotten as he focused on solving the immediate creative problems before him. Later that afternoon, as the California sun began its descent toward the Pacific, Eastwood drove to a small community center on the outskirts of Carmel. He rarely visited this place during a film shoot, preferring to keep his volunteer work separate from his Hollywood life. But today, something about the young biker's note had prompted him to make an exception. The building was modest, its paint fading in places, a simple sign identifying it as the Carmel Youth Center. Inside, the sounds of children's voices echoed down the hallway. Eastwood nodded to the receptionist, who greeted him without fanfare. His support of this place was well known locally, but he wasn't treated with the reverence that followed him in Hollywood circles. He made his way to a large room at the back of the building, pausing in the doorway to observe without interrupting. 20 or so children, ranging in age from about 8 to 15, stood in neat rows on a matted floor. They wore white GIs with various colored belts, mostly white and yellow, marking them as beginners. At the front of the room, a stocky, middle-aged man led them through basic karate forms. Eastwood watched as the instructor moved among the students, gently correcting stances, demonstrating proper technique. The man's teaching style was patient but firm, his voice calm, even when addressing mistakes. The children responded with focused attention unusual for their ages. After a few minutes, the instructor noticed Eastwood in the doorway and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, without pausing the lesson. This was their arrangement. Eastwood provided financial support for the program, but rarely interfered with its operation. His occasional visits were as an observer, not a celebrity. The class continued for another 20 minutes. Eastwood remained in the doorway, watching as the children practiced their punches and blocks with varying degrees of coordination. Some showed natural aptitude. Others struggled with the basic movements, but all were given the same respectful guidance. Finally, the instructor called the class to attention. The children bowed to him, then to the front of the room where a small shrine held pictures of past masters. With a clap of the instructor's hands, the formal structure dissolved, and the room filled with the chattering energy of children released from discipline. As the kids gathered their things and filed out, many casting curious glances at Eastwood, the instructor approached him with a smile. "Didn't expect to see you during a shoot," he said, extending his hand. "Thought you'd be tied up for another week at least." Eastwood shook the offered hand. "Wanted to check in, see how the new mats are working out." "Make a huge difference. The kids can fall without worrying now." The instructor gestured to the blue mats that covered the floor, purchased with a donation Eastwood had made earlier that year. "You staying for the teen class? Got some promising students this session." "Can't today, just wanted to see the program in action." They walked together toward the small office adjoining the training room. "Got something for you," Eastwood said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to the instructor. "For the scholarship fund." The instructor accepted the envelope without opening it. They both knew what it contained, enough money to ensure that several children who couldn't afford the program fees could continue their training. This was a regular contribution Eastwood made, though the amounts varied. "Thank you. Makes a real difference for some of these kids." Eastwood nodded. "Got any adults asking about classes lately?" The instructor looked surprised at the question. "Funny you should ask. Had a young guy come in yesterday. Early 20s, kind of rough around the edges. Said his grandfather used to teach in San Francisco." "He sign up?" "Paid for 6 months up front. Seemed pretty determined." The instructor studied Eastwood's face. "You know him?" "We met briefly," Eastwood replied, offering no further explanation. "Keep an eye on him, will you? Might need extra guidance." "Will do." The instructor had worked with Eastwood long enough to know when not to press for details. As Eastwood turned to leave, the instructor added, "He mentioned something interesting when he signed up. Said he'd heard that training here might help him find his center. Use that exact phrase, find his center. Not something most beginners talk about." Eastwood allowed himself a small smile. Smart kid, smarter than he knows. Driving back to the set for the evening shoot, Eastwood felt a sense of completion that went beyond finishing his current film. The highway confrontation with the bikers had created an unexpected ripple effect, touching lives in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The young man was taking steps toward change, finding his own path to discipline. The metal in the wooden box had found a new home, a symbol passed from one generation to the next. These quiet impacts, invisible to most of the world, meant more to Eastwood than the public accolades he'd received throughout his career. No headlines would announce that a troubled young man had found a better direction. No critics would review the small moment of connection that had sparked this change. Yet these were the real stories that mattered, the ones that unfolded in ordinary lives, far from cameras and spotlights. As the sun set over Carmel, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and purples worthy of a film scene, Eastwood thought about the note again. Some lessons you have to learn the hard way. True enough. But sometimes those were the lessons that stuck with you, that changed your course when nothing else could. He pulled into the studio lot, ready for the evening's work. Tomorrow they would film the final scene, and another story would be complete. But the story that had begun on the highway with 3 bikers would continue without him now, finding its own way forward. And that, Eastwood reflected as he walked toward the waiting crew, was exactly as it should be.